Hey friends, what's going on? We are in Second Kings today, chapters 1 through 6. I'm going to cover some of yesterday's reading and today's. We're looking a lot at the prophet Elisha. I didn't do an in-depth discussion on Elijah, but man, Elijah and Elisha are really some highlights here. The end of First Kings and into Second Kings, which is interesting because these books, big picture, are kind of about the kings of Israel, the kings of Judah. I spent quite a bit of time last time talking about Israel and Judah as two separate now kingdoms. We call this the divided monarchy. So if you're not tracking with that, go back and watch the last video because it's pretty important to understand that, to understand what's going on here. So again, as I've challenged you before, it's been a little while since I've reminded you guys of that, but try to get an idea of what's going on in each book of the Bible all the way through, so that if somebody asks you, this is, again, the challenge I want to give you. I give you a couple different challenges along the way. But again, we're tracking big picture. But if somebody were to say, hey, First and Second Samuel, what's up with that? First and Second Kings, and you won't be left with kind of like I don't remember. So, right, First and Second Samuel, starts with Samuel's call, moves to Saul, the first king, who Samuel anoints. David, the second king. And remember, they have this huge overlap. And so First and Second Samuel kind of covers a lot of that. First Kings is a lot of Solomon. Like the bulk of it is Solomon's reign, the ups and downs of Solomon, and then after him, the divided kingdom and things start. Towards the end of First Kings, you have a lot with Elijah, the prophet. Again, mentioned last time, we have a lot of people with similar names: Rehoboam, Jeroboam, Elijah, Elisha, and so maybe it would be more convenient for us if they would use different names, but there's some connection there on that. So this story with again, in the midst of these things they're called kings, First and Second Kings, and a lot of them is about the kings of the combined nation with Solomon, and then afterwards Israel, the north, 10 tribes, Judah in the south, and they have different kings all through this time period. The kings in the north in Israel are pretty consistently bad. In the south in Judah, there's some back and forth with that deal. But in the midst of that, again, the substantial amount of time given to the prophets, Elijah and Elisha, which is really cool. This is some great material in the midst of this. A lot that's going on here. So in 2 Kings chapter 2, it's interesting. We've also been sort of tracking a little bit of what's said about and a lot of what's not yet said about after what happens after death. So there's something really cool that happens with Elijah. God takes him. So there's two people that this happens to. Enoch, way back in Genesis, God kind of takes him away. I forget the exact language that's sort of used there. And Elijah, not Elisha. Elisha follows after him, right? So look at chapter 2, 2 Kings. When the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. So there's this whole narratives that is going on here. The prophets ask Elijah, "Do you know what the Lord is going to take? That the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" Yes, he says. There's something I wanted to point out here. So this is cool. in 2 Kings 2. So there's a lot of things in here that weren't like fresh in my mind, or maybe I never really thought much about them, or it'd been so long since I've sort of read it. There's another, actually there'll be two here, one with Elijah and one with Elisha, another parting of the Jordan River. So let's do pop quiz. When do we have water partings, if you will, so far? We have, of course, the Exodus, the Red Sea or Sea of Reeds. That one we know. When Joshua and the people come from Moab into the land in the book of Joshua, the Jordan River is stopped and they walk through, remember, on dry ground. There's the rocks they do and all that. Remember that from Joshua. Here as well, 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 8. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water with it. The water divided to the right and to the left, and the two of them crossed over on dry ground. Elijah then says to Elisha, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken?" This is cool. What would you like? He says, "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." Elijah, whatever you got, I want double. I want that. And he says in verse 10, "You have asked a difficult thing, yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, it will not." So I don't know what all that means. Verse 11, as they were walking along and talking together, suddenly this is interesting, a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elijah saw this and cried out, "My father, my father." And then Elijah saw him no more. Then he took hold of his garment and tore it in two. So this, I think, is the first, not the first, right? We have Enoch. But I'm trying to think of kind of a more robust, like, so generally when people die, it will say like they rested with their ancestors or something like that. This is not paradigmatic. This is not said of this is a unique thing, not a common thing that happens with Elijah, that God takes him, which is really fascinating stuff. And again, it will be interesting to track. There's a lot of things in today's reading that we're going to track forward in the Gospels. So let's keep going. But this is interesting in verse 13, still chapter 2. Elisha picked up Elijah's cloak that had fallen from him and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. He took the cloak that had fallen from Elijah. So I guess as Elijah's being taken by God, his cloak comes and remains there with him, left behind. His cloak's left behind. So he takes his cloak and struck the water with it, the same as Elijah had done. It divided to the right and to the left, and he crossed over. So this is, I think, like symbolic of Elijah kind of taking over, right, this prophetic role from Elijah. He had been with him, but now this is a continuity of their ministry as time here goes on. So we're told, like verse 15, the spirit of Elijah is resting on Elisha. So this is interesting. Some of these there's a couple different mentions here of the company of the prophets, and I've not checked different translations to say if they do different things with this. But it seems like in some of these different towns, there's a group of people with this prophetic gifting that kind of are together, which is kind of cool. I want to learn more about that, maybe if there is more to be learned. But this is interesting. Look at verse 16. Look, they said, we your servants have 50 able men. Let them go and look for your master. Perhaps the Spirit of the Lord has picked him up and set him down on some mountain or in some valley. So this is interesting. their idea of the possibilities that God took Elijah up and then plopped him down somewhere else. So this tells us, I think, again, into this sort of a little bit of an ongoing study, is that they didn't expect people to go somewhere else. They expected them to be on earth or in the earth and under the earth, whatever that meant or didn't mean for kind of future hope. So they didn't say, "Oh, Elijah went to heaven. I guess that makes sense. That's where everybody's going." No, they said, "Well, maybe God took him up and is going to drop him back down." We'll see. So anyway, interesting stuff to think about here. A lot of little stories kind of tucked in here along the way. Miracles. I'm trying to think. There's a few. Oh, by the way, I just wanted to mention this quick. A couple of things back in chapter 1. Sorry, I'm kind of backtracking a little bit here. The reason I'm going back here is because these are things that have New Testament resonances, and what I want us to see is how they have New Testament background. I mean, Old Testament background for new things that happen in the New Testament. And I think we'll really see in our study when we get to the New Testament how important it is to understand the background. So check this out. Verse 8 of chapter 1. They replied, "He had a garment of hair and a leather belt around his waist." So who in the New Testament, pop quiz, has a garment of hair, not cloth, right, but like a fur thing, with a leather belt around his waist? John the Baptist. John the Baptist is connected, and I'm thinking a lot about Luke in his gospel must have really known these scriptures very, very well. In any case, John the Baptist, his parents are told, is going to go like in the, I forget the exact wording, but in the spirit of Elijah. So John the Baptist has this prophetic connection to Elijah. And when people encounter John the Baptist, these right Israelite Jewish people, they knew this story. And so they would have seen this connection between this prophetic ministry of Elijah and of John the Baptist. Also, interesting thing happens here that I think I saw a connection with. And I'm not going to recount this whole story here, but in verse 10 of chapter 1, fire fell from heaven and consumed the captain and his men. And I was thinking of Luke chapter 9, verse 54. No, I didn't just know that verse. I looked it up. But I knew the story. When James and John, Jesus' disciples, asked him, "Should we call down thunder? Or should we call down fire," or something like that? I'm not going to flip there now, but I forget it. So this is the precedent for that idea. So there's a lot of things that are going on here. So in chapter 4, with the widow's olive oil, this miracle is really cool. Reminds me of the Hanukkah story in a way, but it's really cool. And then in chapter 4, this is big. The Shumanite's son restored to life. This is somebody who's dead, who's brought back to, like, dead for a length of time, not like for a second, that is brought back to life. And wow, this is like, has resonances and stories like Lazarus in John's gospel. But even more similar, which is really fascinating, in Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 17, Jesus restores to life a dead boy in the town of Nain, with some very similar connections to this. Again, we're not doing a Bible study just on this, but if you want to explore it more, go to Luke chapter 7. And here's an interesting thing. The town of Nain is very close, in the same area as this town of Shunem. So when we read that story that Jesus does in Luke chapter 7, it has a lot of resonance and geographical similarity to this story. Wow, so much cool Old Testament background to New Testament stuff. Towards the end of chapter 5, a small amount of food is used to feed more people than it should. Another miracle, we see the oil multiplying. We see the dead raised even here, in a sense, or resuscitated, however you want to think about it. It's not resurrection. He would die again, but somebody who was dead and then not dead. This feeding is reminiscent in certain ways of the feeding of the 4,000 and 5,000 in the Gospels that Jesus does. So, wow, Old Testament background really is substantial here. The story of Naaman, chapter 5, is really an interesting story. This guy really seems to have his eyes opened and his pride reshaped to give allegiance to God, and that's really cool. At the end of chapter 6, well, not the end, well, midway through chapter 6, look at verse 17. That's really interesting. All right, I'm going to stop there. Keep it a shortish video today. I've been, I think, trying to keep these closer to 20 than 30, which they somewhat was. But here's what I want to ask you. What are your thoughts about the ministry, the life ministry of Elisha? What are your thoughts? What stands out to you? What seems really interesting? What seems confusing? What connections do you see to other parts of the Bible? I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments, and I will see you again soon. Bye.